then you can just kind of sit on your hands, I guess. Because this is our focus today is if you don't know that you have one, or if you're not sure about, say, what unit they were in, or when they served exactly, or where, or why, and the why is kind of speculative, I'll have to say, then this one is for you. So first of all, kind of an overview, some statistics from the Civil War. Unfortunately, in those days, the records were pretty poor. There were lots of people who ended up lost in the system, shall we say. So there were about 5 million men who served, and of course they were, with very few exceptions, all men. There were nurses who were female, and there were some small number of women who managed to sneak in and serve in a regular unit, and undiscovered at least for a while. There were about 1 to 1.5 million casualties being deaths and wounds. So it was pretty devastating. And of those, the estimates vary widely, and they've sort of been updated lately as they've used the census to try to say, okay, if this person was in and then doesn't show up in the 1870 census, chances are he died. So somewhere between, say, 700,000 to 850,000 deaths between the two sides combined, which is a big percentage. And about 20% of those consistently was from illness. And of course, in those days, their means for dealing with infections and that kind of thing were pretty limited. And most of these were dysentery and gastrointestinal issues, a large number of them. So the first question, who did my ancestor serve in the Civil War? Well, there are a couple of questions you want to ask. First of all, was he the right age? Most soldiers were between 18 and 30. And so they were born between 1831 and 1846. Some were younger, and as we will see, some were older. But if you know that a man was in that age group, that makes him prime possibilities. And the second place to look is someone who died during or shortly after the Civil War, even if you don't know if they served. So if you've got somebody that was alive in 1860 and died, a man, and died of the right age and died before 1870 or disappeared, there's a pretty good chance that that's what happened, because these are young guys. They weren't just dying of natural causes. So, second question, what unit was my ancestor in? Now, there were the standing army of the U.S. at the beginning of the Civil War had about 16,000 in it. We didn't have big standing armies. And so when hostilities broke out, we had to look to volunteers, and they were recruited by each state. Maine was a very big one, one of the largest proportionately. And they were recruited at the local level in companies of about 100 or so men, led by a captain. And then 10 companies would be formed into a regiment led by a colonel. For example, there's a fellow you may have heard of. His name is Joshua Chamberlain. He was a colonel, and he was in charge of the 20th Maine Infantry Regiment, as you probably all know. So captain at the company level and a colonel at the regiment level. And of course, they were combined into various hierarchies of units. Most of them were infantry, but there were some cavalry, some light artillery, and some heavy artillery units as well. So, and by the way, if you have questions along the way, just chime in. So, what unit did my ancestor serve in? Resources. Here's a list of 4, and I have a handout that has links to many of them. Let me give you a bunch here and take a bunch over here. And we'll make these available in electronic form so that you can actually use the link. But this will give you at least the URL if you're anxious and you want to type it in. So many of you, I assume, how many are familiar with Find a Grave? Okay, pretty much everybody. Believe it or not, that's actually a great source because family members often will put in a biography on that Find a Grave site, or at least mention that this person served in the Army in the middle of the Civil War. And I'm going to give you examples of each of these. There's also a National Park Service has a database that they call the Soldiers and Sailors. And there's some limitations to that, which I'll describe. And then there are state resources. And I mentioned here the Family Search Research Wiki. If you're not familiar with that, I encourage you to learn about it. It's a great guide to research and all kinds of genealogical and to some degree historical things. And then, of course, local histories. And I have, again, examples of each of those. So let's start with Find a Grave. This is an obituary of Andrew Pottle, printed in the Portland Daily Press on April 2nd, 1894. This is putting all my notes on the hand instead of on the bottom. And in the middle of the obituary, starting here, I know it's hard to read. During the war, enlisted with the 28th Maine Regiment, serving as a musician 2 years. It does not mention, however, that he had 2 sons who also served in the Civil War. Unfortunately, neither of them returned alive. So we'll look at that later, because we'll learn a little more about the Pottles. So the second source I had was the National Park Service database. It's on the handout, the URL to get there. And you can filter, and I'll show you an example. You can do a search on a name and then filter it by state and by the type of unit, like whether this person was in the infantry or the cavalry, whatever. That's the soldiers database, and they're all Union. There's a sailors database, but at this point in time, they're all sailors that were in African-American boats or were African-American sailors. So it's kind of limited that way. So I think I got off here. Got to get back to my. There we go. So this is what it looks like. The National Park database has got this pretty little top and there a little click link and then one line to search a name. And when you put in a name, this one is David P. Haynes, Haines. These are the David P. Haynes. This is the beginning of the list of David P. Hayneses. And as you can see, their results are in the hundreds of thousands. And it does say Confederacy, so I guess it does have some of those in there. They'll pick up anybody named Haynes or anybody named David or whatever. This is just the one that's closest to that. And the one we want is the second one, because he was from New Hampshire. We know that. So when you click on his name, this is the information you get. He was in the 12th Regiment, New Hampshire Infantry, on the Union side, Company K, and he went in as a sergeant and came out as a private. we will learn more about that later. There's a little anomaly in there, or a couple of anomalies. And this even tells you that they have another person. They think it's the same person because he was listed as David Haynes on some and David P. Haynes on some. So this even tells you this role is the role of the National Archives. So if you want to go down there and make yourself sick and dizzy, you can scroll through there and go to that role. But they combine them for the purpose of this. So the Family Search Wiki. This works. I don't know how many of you are familiar with wikis, like the Wikipedia. This is like the Wikipedia, but it's just limited to like genealogical things. And this is the home page. This is the home page you get to by signing up with Family Search, and you have to have an account, but they're free. And trust me, they do not harass you with spam emails or whatever. They just want to make sure that there's not somebody infiltrating their system. So they make sure that there's a real person out there. So give your name and password and you're good to go. And you can explore this whole huge site. This is the world's largest genealogical library by far. It's owned by the Mormon Church, and their religious beliefs involve doing certain procedures for their ancestors. So they have a real thing about genealogy. I mean, as in hundreds and hundreds. They're bigger than Ancestry, which was, I think, started. It's in Salt Lake too. But this is all free, and it's actually fairly easy to use. So when you get to the home page of Family Search, after you've logged in, there's a search tab up here in the menu bar, and you click that, and you can search records and images and family trees and genealogies, and the research wiki is down here close to the bottom. And when you click on that, you get this somewhat distorted world map because they have stuff from all over the world. Basically, their folks went around the world with microfilm machines, and they filmed records, deeds, wills, church records, all kinds of records, which are now stored in Salt Lake and which are now in the process of being completely digitized for the modern era. Much better than when I started, when you had to do this. So this is the Family Search Wiki. And if you click here, you can enter a place or a topic. And their places are a little odd because they want you to put in like the smallest geography and then a comma and then the bigger one. So it's like Belfast, Waldo, Maine. But it's pretty easy once you get used to it. What I put in here was Maine in the Civil War. And I think you have the URL for that specific site here. So the very top of this wiki page about Maine and the Civil War, and they have one of these for every state, is this long list of contents, each of which is a hyperlink to that section within that part of the website. So the one I'm going to talk about today is number 5, which is rosters. This is what we do is we want to find out if our ancestor, what unit our ancestor was in. These are going to be lists of members. So here gives you a reference to a compilation of, this is from the wiki. I went to there's an Adjutant General's books, which we're going to look at separately. And they have a compilation there, which is an alphabetical list of every Maine soldier that was in the Civil War. So I clicked on this section, which is the Pottles. Remember Mr. Pottle? And you can see I searched on Pottle, so they're all highlighted. The one we wanted was this one, who was in Company G of the 28th Maine. Andrew at the top is his son, Andrew Jr., and Benjamin, who's right below him there, is another son. They went down and registered or enlisted, the same day and ended up in the same company. Not unusual. So there are 3 Pottles, all from Lincolnville, all related, who served in the Civil War. And you can find which of those units from this. So, ditto. It's kind of an old-fashioned thing. All right. So another source is local histories. This is part of a page from Joseph Williamson's History of Belfast, part 1, page 903 if you're looking. And I just sort of picked a page at random, and you can see that in his book, which of course is upstairs and in other libraries as well, he's got in here the man's name, his age, when he went in, whether he was married or single, his occupation. Again, that's a way to kind of make sure you get the right one, or maybe you find out something you didn't know. Whether he was a volunteer, a substitute, or a conscript. I didn't mention that the ways you got into the military where you were drafted, that's conscript, or you volunteered, which is what most of them did, or if you got conscripted and you really, really didn't want to go, but you had some money, you could pay somebody to substitute for you. And we'll see an example of that later. And the unit, this particular person was a private in Company I of the 4th Infantry, the Maine 4th. And you got remarks. He was taken prisoner July 21 of 61 and wounded and discharged July 28, 62. Here's somebody in the same, it looks like the same regiment, who was reported as deserted in October of 62. Now, these enlistments were usually for a given time, and sometimes the guys would just leave before their time was up. So that's like deserting. Here's one. All right, he paid $300 bounty to the state. I believe that means so he didn't have to serve. He could hire a conscript, a substitute, or he could pay a bounty. Some places had that. You could pay. All right, because he was a volunteer. Okay, yeah, you're probably right. So anyway, you can see on down here with somebody who was a drum major and other kinds of things, but a lot of information right there, and that's just right upstairs in the book. Yes. So it was paid to encourage them to enlist. Maybe a little bit later on. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, and this is, see, he mustered in 1864. Things weren't going so well yet. Yeah. Yeah, and we usually didn't have to do that, but there were a few apparently. Okay. This is our collective thing. All right, so you've got several different places to find what unit your person served in. So now the question is, well, when? You saw that on the previous slide for those guys, but you may not have access to the Adjutant General's report. I looked up and I think New York has like 200 volumes in their Adjutant General's reports, and they're pretty much not consolidated, so you don't really want to look through all those. So when did my ancestor serve, which will tell you maybe what battles he was in? Well, there are 3 possibilities there that I've highlighted. The states have records and reports of the people from their state, and we'll see examples of each of these. The real great thing, once you find out what state they were from and what unit they were in, is the service record. And there's a summary of the service record at Ancestry for all these folks. It's like 600,000 records in that database, I believe. So you can look up Andrew Pottle and it would tell you where was his service. And we're going to look at that. Or you may know that the 1890 census was pretty much completely wiped out in a fire at the census office, at the archives. Actually, it wasn't the fire, it was the water, because the stuff was in the basement. And when you have a fire up here and you put water on it, guess what? Stuff isn't readable anymore. But the veteran schedule survived. Apparently it was somewhere else. And that was in 1890, the census included a schedule listing all of the living veterans or their unremarried wives. So it's a great source of information for folks that lived that long. So let's look at the state records. Again, annual reports of the Adjutant General of the state of Maine. That's the title of it. And you can link to that from the Family Search Wiki that we just looked at. Or you could also look in Google Books. How many are you familiar with Google Books? See, not so many. There's this like hidden, you know, they've got calendar and maps and Gmail and all that. Well, if you go to a second page when you're looking at Google accessories, there's one called Books. Their effort was to try to get digital images of all the books in the Harvard Public Library or the Harvard University Library, New York Public, and here and there. And they've got a lot of them, all the ones that are not under copyright. Actually, they've got others too, but they say you can't search this because it's under copyright. But you could do a search for Adjutant General's report, say 1863, and it would come up with, okay, here's a copy of it, and you can look at right online. Or any other book from before 1926. That's very handy at times. Or you can get paper copies, which, as far as that, I was just corrected. There are paper copies at the State Library. There are paper copies in the Belfast Free Library, and apparently the Maine Historical Society also has copies of the Adjutant General's reports, and they're about this thick each year, as I recall. And a last note is that these are organized by regiment and company. So you got to know where he served, unless you want to look at all of the people with that same surname in the index at the back. Even for a name like Pottle, you could see that would bring you up a dozen people, and they're scattered in different places. But if you know the unit, you can go right to that. So, service records. And I'm going to start with the one from Ancestry. And, well, that comes out pretty well. You can really read that. So here's our friend Andrew Pottle. And you see that he is listed as being 45 years old and born in about 1817. Many of his records said that, or said that maybe it was about 1820. In actuality, if you look back at the censuses before that and some other documents, it appears that he was actually born in about 1810. So in 1862, he was 52 years old. Enlisted as a private in Maine, went into the Company G of the 28th Infantry. He enlisted, so it tells you how he got in there. And then we have a rank change note in the second column. I put it in 2 columns to get it on the screen. It shows up as 1, as a fifer. So now we know not only was he a musician, we know what he played. He mustered out in August of 1863, so that was about not quite a year, in Augusta, and fought for the Union. Yes, he survived the war. He lived in Rockland, and he died 31 March 1894. So what does that tell you for another place to look for information? What did we just talk about? The 1890 census. He's going to be in there. This is one of his 2 listings. He was in twice, and the second time was a different unit. So there's another listing for him under that unit as well. It was sort of a late in the war They had a few stray folks they put together into some battalions that were unspecified, unassigned. Thank you. So I don't think that it went very long, but they didn't have a place for him, but he had the record. So here's another example. This is for David P. Haynes. And if you remember, this is the fellow who went in as a sergeant and came out as a private. Actually, he wasn't a sergeant until after about a week, as I recall. So here he is. He was from Wolfboro, New Hampshire, enlisted in August of 1862, enlisted as a sergeant, mustered out in September of 1862. Seems a little premature. Oh, I'm sorry, enlisted in August and officially became on the payroll in August. Thanks. So he was in Company K in the 12th Infantry, just like the National Park Service database told us. In the infantry, he enlisted. That's how he got in. And he had a rank change in July 1863. Remember, we had the other Mr. Pottle who had a change. Well, this is a rank change, and then it was to private. He was what they called reduced to ranks. So he was a sergeant, and they busted him down to private. And then he mustered out finally in 1865 in June in Richmond, which is where he was at the time, and was mustered out. Yes, he survived the war. He lived in Wolfboro, New Hampshire, and it's supposed that he's identical with David Haynes, Company A of the 1st New Hampshire Volunteers. Could be. Anyway, that's their thing. Now notice he's actually got a number of changes. So in 1863, he had a change of rank. And this is what year after he went in? October of 1863, which is a key date. Anyway, he was a sergeant and then was made a private. And then he had another change in 1864 to private. And then he had another change later where he was reduced to ranks, is one of these. He had so many changes, they couldn't get them all in one little folder. So when we came across this, it was of great interest because this man happens to be Corliss's great-grandfather. And it didn't look good for David. But we'll find out what happened here. So all right, there we go. So we got from NARA, the National Archives, his complete service records, about this thick. And in that are 3 letters that I'm going to read to you because that's not really very legible. So I knew I'd have to read it. Letter number 1 is dated September 16th, 1863. And it says, this is from Milton Baldwin, the acting assistant surgeon of the 3rd Ward of the United States Army General Hospital in Newark, New Jersey. I do hereby certify that David, he's got T. Haynes, or of course that's a misprint on my part, of Company K, 12th Regiment, New Hampshire Volunteers, was admitted into this hospital July 10th, 1863. Any significance to that date? July 1863, Civil War buffs? Gettysburg was July 1, 2, 3, 4, or 1, 2, 3. So seems might be a coincidence. He came with others from the battlefield of Gettysburg in charge of a surgeon. I know nothing respecting the charge of desertion made against him, as the records show he had deserted. And there's another letter.
That means someone else's records?
What?
When it says about the surgeon, what does that mean?
Well, he came off the battlefield with a doctor and to this hospital in New Jersey. And this is the guy from the New Jersey saying, I don't know anything about a desertion. All I know is he came to us on that date. Well, they marked him deserted. You didn't answer roll call, you weren't here. So here's letter number 2, which is a little bit longer, and is a follow-up by Silas May, who was a captain in the 12th New Hampshire Volunteers, commanding Company K. So this would have been David's commanding officer. At Point Lookout, and it says, Sir, I believe, yes, this is addressed to Brigadier General G. Marston, Commanding District, St. Mary's, Massachusetts. David P. Haynes, a private of Company K, 12th New Hampshire Volunteers, formerly a sergeant. Is there some place I can get where I don't get the echo? Maybe over here. And in said company was reported a deserter and his name dropped from the roll of the company. He being absent without leave on or after the 3rd day of July, 1863, until he voluntarily returned and reported for duty in his company and regiment. So he got in the hospital, he got healed up, he came back, found him. Said David P. Haynes was reduced to the rank of private by order of Captain J.F. Langley, commanding the 12th New Hampshire Volunteers, to date from the 19th day of July, 1863. Being satisfied that said David P. Haynes did not intend to desert, but that his absence was prolonged by sickness, and he not having received a trial by a general court-martial in session at the time, the charge and specifications were preferred against him, I respectfully request that an order be issued returning to duty in his company and regiment. Please enclosed, please find a certificate of surgeon of the hospital in which Haynes was a patient. So we had a copy of the first letter that with that. So that was one of those rank changes because they took him and they made him a sergeant again, since he had an excuse. But then, oops, that's not the one I want. There's one more. Is the one? Yes. This is from A. St. Clair Smith, Captain Company K, 12th New Hampshire Volunteers. And it's dated October 28th, 1864. And it says, I have the honor to request that Private David P. Haynes, Company K, New Hampshire Volunteers, now present in arrest for desertion, be returned to duty without loss or trial. The circumstances of this case, as far as I can learn, are as follows. On or about the night of the 20th of June, 1864, as the regiment was moving towards Petersburg, Virginia, and if you know Civil War history, a lot of stuff happened in Virginia, and a lot of stuff happened near Petersburg at the end of the war, and it was pretty brutal. Anyway, he was moving towards Petersburg while passing troops moving in the contrary direction. Sid Haynes was struck by the wheel of a caisson or piece of artillery and injured. So he got hit by either the wheel or the big artillery piece that it was carrying, you know, right upside the head, as they say. He was taken to the rear and from thence north to the hospital. The company commander, not knowing the reason for his absence, somehow all this happened without the company commander aware of it, or his whereabouts, reported him a deserter and he was dropped from the rolls, something he was kind of used to by then. Anyway, Sid Haynes returned to the regiment from Camp Distribution, Virginia on September 21st of 1864. You couldn't keep this guy away. No, so here he is at Gettysburg and he gets sick and they take him away and he comes back on his own. And then he gets hit upside the head with his caisson and gets injured and then taken to a different hospital. And then he leaves there and comes back to his unit again. So Sid Haynes returned to his unit on September 21st. And as there appears to be no proof of intention to desert, in fact, it's quite the opposite, I make the above request that he be accepted back and not treated as a deserter. So that is the story of David P. Haynes and his adventures as a soldier in the Civil War. So the 1890 veteran schedule, which I mentioned, is next. And this is an example. I took a snippet. This is because this is like it's about a half page because there's a lot of gobbledygook at the bottom. So this is part of one page of the 1890 veteran schedule, which is in Ancestry for Maine. And up at the top, I've marked Andrew. I picked the one that had Andrew D. Pottle. Remember Andrew? The old guy that was in there, the fifer in the 28th Company G. And it gives the dates that he served, when he was discharged. They even added up for you to see how long he served. Now you'll notice that Andrew is repeated again on the second line. It's been bracketed because they know this is the same guy. So after he got out of there, he went back and was assigned as a fifer to the 7th Unassigned Regiment in Maine. And he was there from October of 64 to July of 65, which was, of course, basically after the whole thing was pretty much over. So if you didn't know much about him, this would be a way to get some of that specifics of the dates he served. And I wanted to mention too, this third one here, Reuben Rich. Reuben is deceased. This is his widow's entry, Sarah J. So it even, if you didn't know who the guy was married to, it would give you a clue. Look for Sarah J. Rich. And he had been a private in Company E, the 28th Maine in the infantry, and served from 1862 to X'd out because he wasn't discharged, he died. So lots of information. There's a whole, as I say, there's a half a page of this, and then the bottom half is like notes. This is number 27 and 28 and 29, and down below, they will tell you if there's some other information down there. So another source of information about when your veteran served. And why is that important? Because now you know what unit he was in and when he was there, if he wasn't in the hospital. So you might want to know, where did he fight? Where was his unit? Well, here's some resources. Back to the National Park Service data set. They have a separate data set for units as well as for soldiers. The Wikipedia, believe it or not. And so this is, just those two is all I'm going to talk about. So this is, if you can get here two different ways. You can find your soldier like David Haynes, and it said 12th Infantry. You can click on, that's a link, and that'll take you to this page. Or they have a whole section that's just assigned to units, and you can scroll through and find the 12th New Hampshire and sign up. Click on that. So this tells you where it was organized, what parts of the larger divisions it was. Like in his case, it was assigned to the Howard's Brigade of Heinzelman's Division of McDowell's Army of the Northeast of Virginia. And then they changed it a few times. So you know who the big honchos were that were commanding that. So if you look at a map of a battlefield, often they will only have like a division level or even a corps level. Well, this at least gives you an idea of where physically where this guy was in the battle. So we were able to, for example, find out exactly where the 12th New Hampshire was located in Gettysburg, next to a farmhouse, at least on the day that he left. And then the service, and this gives you all the detail. They were, in 1861, they were in Meridian Hill, the defenses of Washington. Then they advanced on Manassas. They were in the Battle of Bull Run. Then they had duty in defending Washington, D.C. until March of 62. Then they advanced on Manassas again. And then they moved to the Peninsula and the Peninsula Campaign and so forth and so on. And there's a last paragraph that you can't see here that provides you with account of the number of casualties, men and officers, and the various causes in that unit. So the Wikipedia was the other source, and it contains a lot of the same information as the National Park Service database. one of the things I like in this is that there's a sidebar in each of these units. So you just like go to the Wikipedia and search for like 12th New Hampshire, 20th Maine, 17th Illinois, whatever. And it'll bring you up an article on that. And there's a sidebar on them that has a list of what I would call the major engagements, because some of these in the National Park Service, it'll be like so-and-so's bridge. I have no idea where that is. But if it says Bull Run, people have heard of that. So the regular Wikipedia. Yeah. So if you know when he was in and what unit he was in, remember who, what, when, where shows up. And here's an example. This is engagements. I don't remember which one this was. I bet this is the 12th New Hampshire, because I mentioned about. Anyway, it's the first Battle of Bull Run and the Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. You probably have heard of all these if you've done any reading in it. Gettysburg, the Battle of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, and then the Battle of Cold Harbor. They even made a movie out of that one. Yes.
One thing to solve this, I've done a lot of Civil War stuff. Constantly units were having attached.
Mm-hmm.
So you oftentimes have a sergeant and 12 privates detached to help a river guarding a river crossing.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that you're a unit.
You're right. You're right. They might be in two different locations.
Third of the people dropped off along the way,
Mm-hmm.
escorting wagon trains, guarding depots.
Right.
Like that. So
That's a good point.
At a battle doesn't necessarily mean your person is there, but you actually see a role from that.
Yeah, that's a very good point, because you need to know, because they divided it up. Maybe Company E would be sent here and Company G would be sent somewhere else.
Time to get into one of the battles after. Regiment may have been down 250 to 350 men.
Mm-hmm.
And whittled down, and the way they did replacements, a lot of times they form a new regiment.
Well, I was going to say, a lot of times they got so small that they said, well, we put them in with this other regiment. They just kind of combined them and made them a new one. But that usually shows up in the records. But you're right. Pieces of a regiment would get assigned various places. Yeah. Yeah. And these are our homeboys, right? It's our guys. So that's a good point. Thank you for that. So why? That's a ponderous question, and there are lots of reasons. For some, it was a belief in the cause, and that's true of both sides, very ardent patriotism. For some, it was these are young guys. This is a spirit of adventure. You get to leave home and go someplace new. And you know, when the Civil War began, people thought of it as a sort of an adventure. I mean, it was an Antietam that people camped up on in Washington on the Heights and looked out over the battlefield and watched it. I think it was one of the very early ones that was near DC. So the ladies are out there, you know, with their umbrellas and stuff, and they're watching this battle down below. It was going to be a glorious adventure, but then they learned that maybe war wasn't like that. Yeah, first one's like a party, exactly. In some cases, it was to get money to support the family. Many of these were poor people, and this was a way, well, I can't get a job, so I'll go in, and then that money, my pay will go back to my family. Maybe avoidant imprisonment. I have an example of this one from Belfast, actually. And there might be other reasons that we haven't hit on here. These are just the ones that came to my mind.
Voluntold? Was it like the expectation that you would do it?
Well, you mean the imprisonment one?
No, like bullied into serving.
Oh, I suppose there may be some peer pressure, or maybe pressure in the family. Yeah.
How they enlisted those units? In fact, you know, most everybody was from Belfast.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Belfast, Airport, or
Yeah.
Prospect.
Right. Yeah, you and your buddy. Well, like the two brothers we saw. Yeah. Well, the first case study I have is for a man by the name of Nathan Winslow from Belfast. And he was born about 1843 and was an orphan pretty early on and kind of lived on his own. And on 24 September 1862, he broke into Calvin Hervey's jewelry store on High Street. And then he grabbed the stuff, I guess, out of a safe. It must have been unlocked. And he fled to New York. And he tried to get rid of he tried to sell the jewelry. And he was quickly caught and brought back to Belfast. So quickly that they recovered all the jewelry. He'd been unsuccessful at selling any of it. And so he pled guilty. Yes, I stole it. And so the judge said, you can go free if you go into the army. So he was one of those that, okay, that's better than going to jail. So he chose the army. He went into Company K of the 4th Maine Infantry. This was now May of, it says 19, that's a typo, obviously, 1863. He was captured at a place called Totopotomoy. That close? Potomotomy, okay. This is David's turf. So he was captured there in 28 May 1864. So he managed to be there for a month. And he then was taken to Andersonville, the famous Andersonville prison, where he died like, what is that, June, July, 3 months after he was captured. So maybe he would have been bad off in prison, but this option didn't work out so well for Nathan either. So here's another example. We talked about Andrew Pottle at length. He was born, I'm saying he was born in 1810, because at a time when there was no reason for him to lie about his age, that's what it seemed to be pretty consistently, based on when he got married and had children and the censuses and so forth. He didn't really own much. In 1860, the census included an estimate of the value of your real property and your personal property. And a lot of times that didn't show up in there, but a lot of times it was in there because that's what it was supposed to be. He had no real property, no real estate, and his personal property was valued at $300, which if you look at the other families in the neighborhood was really toward the low end. So he enlisted in September of 1862, as we know now. He was the fifer. He was discharged a year later and then re-enlisted in October of 1864 and finally mustered out in July of 1865. And as we know, he died in 1894. He was 83 years old, and at that time he was the oldest living Civil War veteran in Maine, which is kind of cool. So I'm guessing that maybe the fact that he had very little property, he had 4 kids still at home, I believe, that maybe one of his reasons was to get money to send home. Now, remember, he also had 2 sons that went in. Actually, they went in before he did. They enlisted together in 1861. Benjamin was captured near Richmond and was paroled. That means he was like swapped out as a prisoner. But he died on the 12th of July in 1862. He died on a boat. He was so sick that he didn't survive getting on the boat and coming home. Andrew Jr. was captured at Gettysburg, went to Andersonville, and died there in May of 1864. And I don't know, is there any estimate, David, about the percentage of soldiers or prisoners that were there, prisoners of war, who didn't survive?
Yeah, no, there's an immediate stop in there too. Gettysburg,
Mm-hmm.
Bell Island, which
But once they made it to Andersonville,
the death rate was great.
Yeah.
I don't know if you see a percentage. I don't see a percentage of it.
well, that's true. Yeah. Yes.
But there were some survivors.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Personal war War museum down in Andersonville. Now, one of the things they actually point out, Elmira Prison in New York and Camp Chase, Ohio, that were a lot of the southern prisoners with, had a higher death rates than Andersonville. And of course, the winter's right history, so, but the Civil War, not just Civil War, it's a prisoner of war museum,
Mhm.
in Andersonville, has a big thing, and they were pointing out that there were, I think, at least 3 northern prison camps, and most of that was actually thought due to corruption. The guy down in Andersonville was dealing with, there were no rations to give out because the guys in the field weren't getting any rations either.
Yeah, they weren't able to feed the soldier. They weren't about.
And as well as all of their blankets. So housing guys outside in the winter and selling off their blankets is not a great way to have people survive.
Even in Georgia. Oh, you're talking about New York, yeah.
That rate. Want to throw a number at it, might just throw about 30%.
Mhm.
In Richmond, it developed.
Hmm?
Can you repeat what he said for the new?
Oh, David is saying that the rates for survival or non-survival in the southern camps like Andersonville or the northern camps like were just mentioned, I forgot we should have grabbed the microphone, were about the same, roughly.
Death rate in Richmond was about 1,500 souls.
Okay. Yes.
The people at Andersonville weren't necessarily all soldiers. My father-in-law's grandfather was a sea captain, and he used to go back and forth
Mhm.
from Maine to Florida. And he had the misfortune of getting down to Florida about the time the war broke out, and they took him captive, put him in Andersonville. The only reason why he survived is a guy that was one of the guards. He knew him from the time that he went to Florida. The guy gave him extra food.
Ah,
That's
so he was corrupt in the other way. Yeah, well, that makes sense. They were prisoners of war of some sort.
the wrong place, the wrong time.
Yeah, yes, just like Nathan Winslow. Okay. So what we've tried to do today is to have a brief and selective introduction to genealogical resources. I didn't talk about pensions, for example. Pension files have a lot of really fascinating information, but most of what's in there you're going to have to know to get to, I mean, you need to know the unit and so forth. And so it won't add to the wartime information, but it'll tell you about the marriages and where he came from and that kind of thing to document eligibility for the pension. So these are different resources that you can use to determine whether your ancestor served in the Civil War, who, if so, what unit, when and where he served, and we also talked about some possible motivations for entering the service, which are probably a few we didn't touch upon, but at least you got to start. And this should help you get some more information about your Civil War ancestor. Any further questions? Yes.
Do you have the microphone turned? I'm worried it's gonna feedback, but. I'll
Oh, okay.
try.
I could turn
I
around.
was just going to say, in regard to my poor great grandfather, is it correct that if I hadn't sent for his complete military record, there would have been no other way of explaining his reduction in rank and so forth?
Wouldn't have gotten those, right,
Right,
those
'cause
letters.
those letters only existed in that file.
Yeah, Rick, just to mention a couple of other resources for Maine units. There's a book called Maine in the War for the Union. This is a reprint. It talks about every single regiment, who they commanded by, where they served, what their casualty rates were. And this is fairly inexpensive as a reprint. And for Gettysburg, I had an ancestor at Gettysburg. This is a book based on a report. Joshua Chamberlain, I think, was he was on the commission, written shortly after the war. And this is all the units that participated in Gettysburg and what they did and what their casualty rates were too.
Yeah, I meant to mention the regimental histories, which a lot of those have been written up, and you get the day-to-day in there.
Rick, that was excellent. I really appreciate you allowing me to sit in your group, and Rick and I have just.
We're not exclusive.
We have just, yeah, your dues for this group are pretty steep though, $5 a year.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know. I may have to reconsider, but, yeah, no, we've communicated back and forth through emails, and I threw the potals at you, and you did such a fantastic job digging up that family history. I'm actually tomorrow night giving a thing in Lincolnville, Historical Society, and some of your.
I'm going to sneak into your.
Yeah, I put your name on it to give you credit. But just to be fair and balanced, since everything you've presented for these digital sources are union, they're union guys. You can't find the rebels in there. And I try to be fair and balanced and look for both, since I'm from Virginia and Richmond specifically. So it's really tough looking at, there aren't too many, I don't see too many rebel families in this room right now, but we do have to represent ourselves. And the only, you may have run across something, but I'll throw this at you, see what you say. I have found no digital online sources for the Confederate soldiers, similar to all the ones that you've shown.
They were listed as a possibility in the Park Service database,
You know,
but I don't know
have
how,
not-
I don't know how complete
I
that
have
is.
not-
Probably not.
Yeah, it's not very complete, but I did find in print that was published in 1996. It's a 16-volume set, a more recent publication of old data called The Roster of Confederate Soldiers, 1861 to 1865. It has all their guys. It's like a giant Maine Adjutant General report for the Southerners, and I can't find it digitally. I have not found the motivation to pay the $1,400 to buy that set.
So that's not what in your collection.
No, but I'm going to pass the hat tomorrow so I can, so I can start saving up, because I need that set. But I would just say, to be fair to the rebels, that, what do you got there? Oh, it does. American Civil Research Database. Steve, I'll have.
There's a lot of stuff. I mean, the Civil War. has been
Civil
just
War,
studied to death.
civilwardata.com. I'm almost civilwardata.com.
Gateway too, like I think it's got some.
I don't have that many.
Mhm.
Most of my relatives were encouraged to join the Union Army when they came down the Tennessee River.
Well, in the spirit of full disclosure, I can say that I've only come across one of my direct ancestors who was a Civil War veteran. I had more Quakers on one side that did not fight. I had German Dunkers on the other side. They were also pacifists. So there weren't too many of the right age to have gone, but I do have one. And he was, his occupation was saddler. He made saddles. And so he went into the cavalry from North Carolina. So he was a rebel. So that's my only one. But it's worth studying all of this. And once you get into it, it's a whole renewed interest in this era. And if you, and of course, I think the Civil War thing by, what's his name, is on the PBS Passport. So, yeah, thank you, Ken Burns. So that's really all I had today, and thank you all for coming. Mhm.
If you want to hone in on some of these things, the ORs, which is the official records of the War of the Rebellion, it's only
Oh, yes.
128 3-inch thick volumes, and it's a place to go look up. I've got one of the first generation DVDs of it. I've got some of the individual volumes of things that I was interested in, but it's literally a whole wall full of books. And it has every imaginable piece of paper that the Union had got published over about, I guess, a 10-year time period.
Yeah,
But they-
I have that first edition, that set.
Yeah. Of
There's
the,
actually one even bigger than that. That's
oh, there's supplements after the
Yeah, there's
first.
another one, 128 volume.
That's what I've got, is 128.
Oh, you have that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's, yeah, that's an I've been going through that. You find all the letters and correspondence in there. You won't find individual
You need the
soldiers.
mic
No.
so the Zoom people can hear you.
Oh.
Yeah. She's saying, don't worry about it.
Give us a commercial on the next month's genealogy club.
David, that's your department. If you get the mic.
I understand somebody's gonna be our speaker.
Like I said earlier, I'm passing the hat.
Not to be a speaker.
So, Rick was very nice to, as we corresponded, to invite me to give a talk because I have been very interested in individual soldiers, much like Rick presented, and pulling out these individual soldiers that were Maine soldiers fighting in Virginia, because I spent 25 years in Richmond. And that was the connection. Find the obscure Maine soldier fighting and dying in around central Virginia, around Richmond. And so I went through cemeteries all throughout Richmond for several years, and just found a stone, a Maine guy. This particular soldier named Grover was his last name. And I just found his stone southwest of Petersburg, Virginia, on a small cemetery. And I went backwards and traced him and his life history using some of the same stuff that Rick's had. And a lot of that's name, rank, and serial number. It's interesting to us Civil War buffs, but maybe not to others. So the basic of the talk is to talk about this soldier and his history and all the things that Rick did in terms of where he fought and wounded and re-enlisted and all that good stuff. But then what you'll find in this talk is the story behind me finding his previously unpublished and unstudied diary from a descendant who lives in Glendale, Arizona. It's a very interesting story how I stumbled onto that diary. And there's a surprise at the end that's connected to that diary that I ain't gonna tell you. It was, thank God for COVID, because I had the time. Hours and hours of digging, much like you saw from Rick, but then a few other steps. But it's to find this stone that said Maine and a guy's name on it, an obscure guy, lost to history, and can you trace it backwards? Sometimes you can.
All right, so come back next month, everyone. Third Wednesday of the month.
Build up your energy level. You won't leave here like Andersonville. You'll be well fed by our wonderful refreshment.
Yes.
So enjoy.
All right, thank you everyone on Zoom. I hope you have a great day.